Welcome to the High Rise Podcast, presented by Headset, the leading data and analytics company for the cannabis industry.
Welcome back to the High Rise, a laid-back, data-back conversation where we talk all things cannabis from US MSOs to Canadian LPs, products and market analysis through the lens of data. My name is Cy Scott with Headset, and I'm joined, as always, by Emily Paxi of Poseidon.
Hi, everyone. Welcome to the High Rise.
And today we have a very special guest with Suzan Nickelson, CEO of Holistic Solution. Welcome to the High Rise, Suzan.
Thank you guys for having me. Excited to be here today.
Yeah, very much looking forward to the conversation. Before we dive in, maybe you could give our listeners just a bit of your background and you know where you're coming from and how you got into the cannabis space.
Again, thanks. Suzan Nickelson, CEO of Holistic Solutions. We are a Class 5 retail medicinal alternative treatment center, newly awarded first female and Black woman to own a license here in the great state of New Jersey. So we're also convertible adult use. So we're going to be opening our retail dispensary in the fall of 2022 in Waterford, New Jersey, which is located in Camden, New Jersey. So my background is by way of everything I've learned about cannabis. I happily say I've learned from my mother. I come from a long line of herbalists. So by way of family background, we come from Africa, specifically Ghana. And through the slave trade, our family ended up on the beautiful shores of Jamaica. And in that, our family are what is known as Maroons, escaped slaves that built their own sovereignty, economic, that existed up into the hills. And during that time, creating their own ecosystems, cannabis, along with other agricultural products, were constantly bartered in trade. But unbeknownst to many people, that there were a long line of women that curated the plant as caretakers, both medicinally, spiritually, and also for economic sovereignty. So in that, my mother was an herbalist, and those traditions were passed down to her, and she also passed them down to us. My parents met in the 70s, my father being a white Jewish male officer who had served proudly in World War II as an Army Tech 5, who was actively working as a sheriff officer with a canine dog, met a beautiful woman in the Bahamas who was on a modeling shoot, who comes by way of African, Taino, Indian, Jamaican. So my mother, Josephine Elaine, had an unconventional love story in that there was no internet, no social media. And in that, love produced 3 children, and we came to the country in 1975. And in coming to the country, my mother always said that she brought the children and apparently others, things which specifically cannabis. Unbeknownst to my father, my mother started a home grow in our backyard. And you can understand when my father found out the lively and livid discussions that occurred in our household. My mother was actually outed by our canine dog, Junction. So in my mother's conversation of her advocacy for the plant, she explained to Joseph that, they were farmers. This was part of their trade and their culture. And he explained the criminalization. And not only that, he could be arrested and fired and lose his job, but my mother could also be incarcerated. And out of respect for my father, my mother put away her herbalist traditions. Sometime later, in 1996, the conversation revisited itself when my mother called and stated that, unfortunately, the doctors had told her that she had a year to live. And in that, I had made my trek home to talk to my siblings and really planning my mother's last days. But my mother, being the very spirited woman that she was, she believed that if she had cannabis and the cannabis that she was used to and the forms and strains, that she could sustain her lifespan. And in that, as you can understand, it was a very hard chance because cannabis was highly criminalized in the 90s, leading up to some parts where it's had medical sovereignty and now adult use. So our family made a very good decision in that supporting my mother and her cannabis. And my mother lived until June 12th, 2013. So she lived a happy life that was extended with her use of cannabis. And in that, she taught us the traditions of her culture. And it became important to us after her transition to really pay homage and really to kind of gain better access to a plant that was very misunderstood, and really recreate and destigmatize and bring a different voice, and that being of a Black female voice. So in 2018, the state of New Jersey had put out information that they were going to be putting out an RFA. And in that, I put in an application. And in our application, we were selected in 2021 as being the first female Black-owned, majority owner dispensary. So It has been a labor of love, even naming the company Holistic Solutions out of my mother, because everything about cannabis has been from a holistic perspective.
What an incredible story. Thank you so much for sharing that. And I do have a family history around the healing properties of this plant as well. So just hearing your story about that is really impressive. And I am sure it's going to translate to anyone who comes to visit your store. So I can't wait to be among them. So would you mind sharing a little bit about what it's like to be starting a business in cannabis? I think there's a lot of misperceptions and massive gaps in understanding that this is very different from starting just a coffee shop or a bar or restaurant, or any other small business. Would you mind helping our listeners to understand what this is like?
Sure. We were self-funded, meaning that every aspect of our company came from initially my personal savings. In that starting the company's design, I remember laughingly that I didn't own a computer, but started the concept and design on my iPhone 6 Plus. And I worked at night after putting my children down. In that, gaining access to capital really became important in understanding that having to engage with banks, having to use personal savings that were really our rainy day fund, and making that reinvestment in myself. So in that, securing vendors and contractors who would be willing to work with the woman of color, specifically in cannabis, dealing with the Schedule I drug that still is very stigmatized and people think very criminalized, and having to explain to them that they could take a chance in working with us and building a company. So in building a company and gaining, not coming from trust funds, I'm a single mother of 3 children. Previously, I had worked for the state of New Jersey as my employer. So in that, I depended on my state salary and what I thought was going to be a pension and security. But in looking at working with banks, I had something as no collateral, no hard assets. There was nothing that I could barter and trade with or materialize or monetize that could suffice to them in giving me what could be a traditional loan. So in that, my banking experience was pretty hard. It was very cumbersome in getting a basic banking account. And that our first accounts, I like to tell the pretty woman story. There are biases in banking. I show up with my female partners at the time who are Caucasian women, and they had many of the questions posed to them, which they comically couldn't answer. And they turned to them and said, well, Suzanne's the CEO, she should be able to answer the questions. And then the tone of the engagement shifted to where it was 10 additional documents that were needed. But because I come from a regulatory background, I concurrently planned, and we had all the documents needed to be able to get the account. But then shortly after, out of our first wire of funding from a CBD company that we were doing a joint venture with, our account was closed. There was no reason given, is that they didn't want our bank, they didn't want our money, and then we had to come get our funding by Friday. As you can imagine, we wrote checks. There were things in the supply chain that I couldn't withdraw. But more importantly, we had to have, per the regulations, maintain a compliant bank account. And also having to not have money in order to pay for vendor services. Equity was meaning, which is a part of a percentage of the company that I owned. I had to really think about, how do I maybe have to give up parts of my company in order to get my project funded? So in that, I took on a really great partner who was a female woman who I really called a great ally in Marissa, and that she was also an entrepreneur in her own rights and had really skyrocketed in the tech and manufacturing and regulatory field. And she became my business partner. And that she opened up her business resources in the community that was very comfortable with her, who also got a chance to know me, and who also became our support. So I got a bank account through a referral of Marissa and her company, always already doing business. So in using strategic people, our access became easier. Unfortunately, again, with bias, as you hear in bias in housing, of having individuals of color get low ratings or low valuations of their homes, I often would recommend, and did have to recommend, that I stay off camera during discussions with potential investment brokers, because it would be variable favorable first introduction, second introduction, But by the third introduction, where we maybe would be getting in person and a woman of color shows up, sometimes the tone would change. Sometimes the rates would be different. Sometimes, again, the issue of collateral became very real, or a larger request of my business, or a more predatory engagement. So in that, gaining the understanding of having regulators have loans, grants, forgiveness opportunities, of having individuals having co-locations of real estate, all great things that help social equity and minority women business owned operators such as myself getting a footing. Having accesses to traditional banking, meaning that traditional banking is not open to me. I can't get pension services. I don't have a debit account. We only can get a check in our state. So in that, we have to rely on old school traditional ways of having to do banking engagement. That there are still large portions of having to want to scale and expand our company, that those doors are either closed or that they're very high entry barriers of impediments to get there. So when we look at things like SAFE and the Climb Act, it really continues for an operational and an advocacy perspective, as an owner, to really push for those discussions and those legislations to really get passed, because they would be extremely helpful to our day-to-day existence. Because without them, the materialization of brown and Black entrepreneurs and women, and having diverse entrepreneurship within the cannabis industry, I believe will become very, very slim. I represent a very small population of an unrepresented market of 2% of ownership of owners of color. However, we are overrepresented in the criminalization and the terrorization of our families for decades. And in that, restorative and economic justice, we believe, don't have to be competing points, but two great bookends of the same book, but a different journey of how we get there.
Absolutely right. And we need to change those percentages drastically, both down and up, respectively. And so I really appreciate you helping the listeners to understand what it's like to try to even just get a bank account open. And I have to tell you, I've lost so many bank accounts in the course of my time in this industry. And I loved your pretty woman comment, because I am going to walk around and remind everyone of what a big mistake they made over these years. Nothing like almost missing payroll or not being able to pay it's just extraordinarily frustrating. And one of the things I think I hear people say, oh yeah, but there are banks working with the industry. Yes, but there are few. And so what I'm hearing from your story is that when there are few, there's essentially no market. So they're not working hard for your business. In fact, they're working hard for you to have your business. And I think that that's a huge disconnect, because you're really the customer, and they should want your business. And I think that when there's more competition, more banks serving the industry, if these laws could change, then you would have a different set of conversations around this, or at least it would help to improve it, I think, a little bit.
I think it would help improve it on many levels, from the valuation of how my company is valued as an asset, to how I get economic supports, such as regular business supports that all other companies are afforded. And in a legalized state with state sovereignty, we still have those barriers denied to us as operators. The 280E process is a matter that definitely has to be addressed. Some states have looked at decoupling the 280E, and we hope that New Jersey takes those amendments and looks at that. We have great leadership here in our state, and we've been really happy with the direction that we've gone in the legislative and both equity route. And we believe through continued partnership that we're going to really do great things here in New Jersey.
Yeah, and just coming back to your point too about that you had to offer up equity of your business, which, is hard when companies are younger. There's just not as much you can give up, because you've got to continuously kind of raise and get things going. In other ordinary businesses, you have lines of credit, working lines of capital. I mean, forget the fact that we can't get you can't have a debit relationship with your bank. What it would mean to your business to be able to have a working line of credit would be tremendous, because it would help you with everything from inventory to working capital. And I think that, and those resources, Andrea Cabral was on the podcast early at the beginning of this year, and she really talked about some of the lending resources that we can't even contemplate for this industry, but would be so meaningful for a store that's opening. So I think that the gaps around this are so immense, not just beyond having the bank account, but what then comes next when you're trying to run a business.
Oh, absolutely. I think from having access to capital with a line of credit would give me the capital that I need to fund my project, which would not have forced me to give out any equity shares of my company. And not having the capital to fund the project, and without having hard assets and collateral or anything to monetize the license, my only other resource was equity. And then even on the debt side, the valuation of how cannabis companies are evaluated are also drastically unfair, in that it only negatively affects entrepreneurs of color, and that the amount of generational wealth that we leave on the table compared to our counterparts is drastic. And again, discriminatory. Even in the states that legalization and ownership are realized, valuations, how investors look at capital and making investments into company, are all on a skewed system. And that system could be rewritten if, again, Climb Act and SAFE were passed, because it would give owners like myself levity, the same equal advantage to access. And that's all we're looking for, equal access. Because again, we bootstrapped our application. I wrote our application with a great colleague and consultant. And in that, we really hustled for resources, and compared to multi-state operators and others who spend hundreds and even, upwards of potential millions of dollars on these very competitive licenses, I was a Black woman of single mother, again, of 3 children, who started on my iPhone 6 Plus. And if I could have that dream, imagine how many other Suzans sit in homes with the same potential, but don't have the sophistication or access to resources. So again, by pushing these measures for us, just gives us access to something that we can create our own destinies.
Yeah, your story, when you talk about your role and just minority entrepreneurs, and how already challenging it is, it probably just in any category, right? Not even just cannabis, but some of the things you said about walking in with your partners, and then the tone and the tenor of the conversation changes when you're the CEO here. And I think that certainly happens in all sorts of situations. And then you compound it with all the stigma that's associated with cannabis, and just the smaller and smaller pool of groups that will even take that meeting with you, right? Even consider it. So it just like stacks all the cards against any sort of success here for an industry that we're trying to build. And we all talk about social equity, and we talk about trying to change the harms of prohibition. But like at the end of the day, it's like these states will pass laws that enable it, for social equity and applicants and all of that. But it just seems like, that's only like 5% of what needs to be done for anybody to actually be successful here. With your specific story, like how many, Emily, bring up a good point. A lot of people will say there are banks, and it's true, right? But it's like, you can say that there's banks, there's local like state banks that support the industry, but it's like checking a box. Like what's maybe one credit union in the area that's like willing to take some semblance of risk. And even then, they are like, they scrutinize these accounts so much, right? To even allow anybody through is pretty rare, right? But you could say, people do say, well, there is banking, right? But that's not really true. It's not, just because like one bank in a local area takes some accounts, I wouldn't say that it really does exist at all. So with you, was it like one bank that you were able to talk to? Did you have to go to a number of banks? Did you talk to a lot of different investors in the category, or was it just a small? I mean, imagine it would be a small pool anyways. But did you have to take a lot of meetings before you were able to get any semblance of support?
Oh, absolutely. We had to talk to several banks. We went to the regular institutions like the big known, And then they didn't have any cannabis accounts. They weren't even discussing CBD. It was send a generic email to someone in VP of Relations that never emailed you back. So eventually we were able to find out about 2 or 3 banks in New Jersey. So we've been with our bank that's been a leader in the banking space, I would say, in New Jersey for quite some time. It just so happens that they're located in South Jersey, which makes it logistically easy for us. So for us, it's been a better experience. Again, the first experience of having our account closed, having things in limbo was very chaotic and very stressful. Thankfully, again, maybe not everyone had an access to a Marissa or someone on their team who had another avenue of opening doors. So New Jersey does have small community banks that are looking and currently taking cannabis money, but then the other are investors. Most, if not all, investors are private money investors, hedge funds, merger acquisitions, individuals who sometimes don't see individuals like myself as people, more of assets or commodities. And in that, not having the business acumen, I was also blessed, and my significant other comes from that world. So he was able to guide me, and having people within his reach and group that did merger and acquisitions that were able to give us advice for free or pro bono to really look to kind of guide us through our experiences. But again, I think from the investment pool, it's very small and limited. And I think, again, by increasing the access to traditional banking, makes it a bigger pool and gives us better access to resources that we need. If we didn't have to go through all private lending, again, it's skewed. There are biases there, and sometimes those rates are at a higher fee. And what we found out in some lenders, it can be very predatory, meaning that the warrants and actions are set up to where companies are intended to fail. That, it's a structure of you get limited support to where you're going to be in crisis, to where those companies then go into a negative arena, to where those companies are then bought out, to where, again, you lose the investment on the back end of it. So for us, having people that were helpful to navigate, steer us in the best direction. But again, I think that if I had an opportunity of going to a regular banking institution, talking to a regular branch manager, and all that as well, that regular branch manager wouldn't be asking me for equity of my company. It would be a regular recognized entity getting a regular loan. And in that, currently, we don't have those opportunities. We can't offer pensions and other things to our employees. Even how our employees identify us as employers also puts them at risk of getting discriminated with housing, of trying to get employee verification from the employer's perspective. So having to work with systems that understand cannabis and discrimination that we do face, and making sure that how the employee pay stub reads is friendly, that helps our employees also in their regular navigation of life. So I think in all aspects, cannabis not having better banking access through SAFE, as well as Climac, that's also been recently supported, I think are the pathways forward.
I thank you so much for sharing with us about this, because I think there's a misunderstanding on the lawmakers' part that these issues of reform will only benefit the big MSO operators, but the reality is it's actually quite the opposite of that. And I think I think your story is really compelling and important for people to be able to hear, because on a broader issue, it's hard to wrap your arms around things, but when you hear an individual sharing about their experiences and firsthand, I think that's absolutely precious and very important to this process. So thank you so much for coming on today and sharing.
No, thank you guys for having me. I hope that this story really continues to inspire everyone to live their truest and fullest dreams, and just hoping that the hearts and mind of the current legislators to really get SAFE and Climac done this session. It's desperately needed. It really makes the difference of us having sovereignty and really a full opportunity to scale our business, or really continuing to see the industry go in the wrong direction and hoping to right-side it with their support.
Well said. And thanks so much for sharing your story, Suzan. Really, really inspiring. And we feel like it's closer than ever to some change happening here. And I think stories like this will really help move it forward.
Thank you. Holistic Solutions opening up in the fall of 2022. Waterford, New Jersey, looking to have you all visit our store in the lovely state of New Jersey.
We'll be there.
Absolutely.
Thanks for listening to the High Rise Podcast, presented by Headset. For more information on Headset, visit headset.io.